Welcome back, fight fans, to yet another edition of Shootin' the Shit here on the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network, also on combatpress.com. We are here with yet another great guest, another UFC fighter. But before we get to that guest, of course, I do want to plug my sponsor. I know we do have a bigger following in the United States, specifically in Central and Illinois. So if you guys are looking for home improvement work, head over to Facebook and go to Cornelius & Sons. I know it's getting cold out here. I can tell because my heat's on today. The outdoor patio stuff, he may not be able to help you out with much longer. But if you have any indoor construction needs, bathroom, kitchen, flooring, anything like that, go to Cornelius & Sons on Facebook. Look for Raul. He's good. He will give you a fair price, and he will do good work for you. Okay? So with that out of the way, we do have our guest today. He is a UFC bantamweight. He is a top prospect with the company. He's a young guy looking to keep his undefeated record going forward. We have Jack Shore live from Wales. How are you doing today, Jack?
I'm very good, mate. Thank you. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Figured I'll give the audience a quick update. The reason I'm in a kind of a weird setup is because I had Achilles tendon surgery last week. So I'm trying to do this the most comfortable way I can. I'm usually in the office, so that's why there's kind of a weird setup for me today. So Jack, great to have you. Really appreciate you, especially accommodating my schedule since you're over in Wales. It's about 7 in the morning for me right now. Not a big deal. So being from Wales, the first thing I wanted to talk about that is Wales kind of really blew onto the scene in the last couple of years in terms of talent coming out of that country. You know, you got yourself, you've got Brett Johns, who was one of the first guys to kind of make his way over. Kind of how Conor was to Irish MMA. I mean, where did this Welsh explosion come from? I know, like, for Conor, was the big explosion for Irish MMA, in the same way that George St. Pierre was for Canadian MMA. Was there really an influence in Welsh MMA that kind of got a big group of guys like yourself and Brent and all those other guys into the sport?
I think we've always had a good talent pool in Wales, but I think we've really seen it explode since, Brett Johns and Jack Marshall, and they were the first two guys to sign for the UFC, and they fought on the same card there. Their debuts on the same day. And speaking as someone who's sort of been involved in Welsh MMA before and after those guys signed, that was really when it seemed to blow up and get a lot more attention. With the media, just not just the media, but from the fight world in general. I there's no shame in saying I don't think a lot of people really knew where Wales was until those guys started fighting. So we've always had a bit of a name, in boxing, with Joe Calzaghe probably being the most famous one that sort of got the Welsh flag out there. But it was probably 2016 when them two got signed, and then obviously John Phillips slightly after was when it really did explode,
Absolutely, and you're right, and it's going to keep going. One of the guys I have my eye on, and I know you watch MMA yourself, is Mason Jones. He just won his second belt with Cage Warriors, moving up a weight class. I mean, he's clearly a guy that's probably going to make his way over as well, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, without a doubt. I'd be very surprised if Mason doesn't get a call. If not the end of this year, without a doubt, early next year. I think if it wasn't for the fact that we was in, the old COVID scenario, I think he would have already, had the call. He may even have had it, and perhaps he's not telling anyone. But to go up and win a second belt and do it in the style he did it in, a real slugfest, and then obviously get the finish in the first round still. That's everything the UFC sort of looks for in a guy. So I think Mason will be joining us very soon.
Yeah, we'll talk about the COVID in a second, because it's unfortunately a topic that comes up frequently on the show just because of the times we live in. But yeah, we were talking a few weeks ago to Miko Desegni from Italy, who actually just won the AFL Valkyries title last weekend. And she was saying the same thing. She was basically offered a fight in Vegas, UFC Vegas. She trains with Jackson Winklejohn, but because of the travel restrictions, she was stuck in Italy. So she was unable to take a late notice fight in Vegas. Now, yourself, you'll have a fight coming up. Just quickly, is it Fight Island or is it in Vegas?
It's in Vegas, this one.
Okay, but it's not late notice, so you're able to get into the United States with no issue.
Yeah, so I think I had around about, I want to say 10, maybe 9 weeks notice. I mean, we're 3 weeks out now, so about 6 weeks ago we got the call. My manager, Graham Boylan, works very well with the UFC, so he sort of said, look, they want you to go out to Vegas and fight. And in fair play to the UFC, I haven't really had to do a lot. They've sorted all like the paperwork, stuff like that. I've got to go up to London next week now to the embassy to just hand in my paperwork basically and get my visa stamped into my passport then. So, you know, the cornerman, they just got to have like an ESTA, it's called, I think, for them to get out for the show. But I think I have a visa which will allow me then to, I think it's either 2 or 3 years, I'll be allowed to go back and forth America without having to reapply. So fingers crossed, you know, it sets me up for an active year next year. You know, even if we're still in lockdown and still in the pandemic, I'll still be able to get out there and fight. And obviously Fight Island is an option now as well. So whereas like 6 months ago, it was sort of, you know, if I don't fight on Fight Island, where am I going to fight because of the travel ban and stuff in the UK? Whereas now, obviously, having a visa as well is just going to open up a lot more dates and help keep me, you know, busy, I suppose.
Right, and that makes sense because, you know, the reason they had Fight Island and a lot of the fights on Fight Island, I mean, it's not hard to realize, is a lot of European fighters, a lot of Asian fighters, you know, and obviously that has to do with the travel ban, whereas the Vegas card, you know, you had mostly American fighters or European and Asian fighters that exclusively train in America. You know, but then, you know, with all the crazy late replacement things that have been happening, because so many fights have fallen apart and they fall apart within 2 weeks. You know, all those fighters were usually American, whether in Vegas, and when it was in Fight Island, they were usually fighters, you know, if they're on late notice, fighters that made the trip, like Khamzat Chimaev, who, you know, made the trip just in case there was a late replacement fight and he lucked out, or guys that hadn't made the trip but were close enough and had their papers ready. So, I mean, that's kind of the conditions you have to be in now with the current circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of them. Even if you've got a fight booked, I mean, you've got to be ready for. I mean, for my fight in Fight Island, I think the guy I fought in the end, was the 5th name that I was, you know, due to fight. So with the current situation, you know, with traveling and then obviously the COVID test, stuff like that, you've got to be prepared to mix and match it, I suppose, and just fight whoever's in there with you on the night. But I'm very happy, you know, now to get the Vegas thing sorted so that I've got that option as well. Because Fight Island was a great place, but it was very tough in terms of we had to quarantine alone for 2 days in an hotel room before flying out. Obviously, a day's worth of travel and then spend 2 days in an hotel room on the other side. So as far as like, you know, preparation and making weight goes, you know, it just made it a little bit tougher than what it usually is. So, you know, I'm looking forward now to get out to Vegas, seeing how that matches up to Fight Island, and then hopefully I can give the UFC my preference on the two then, and they can keep it on one or the other.
Yeah, you'll get to choose. Yeah, I like this one better than the other one. That's probably a little bit of an advantage compared to the guys only doing one or the other. So obviously we're talking about COVID protocols. This is more of a 2-part question. Number one, with the lockdowns, I know just from looking at the news, the UK had pretty stiff lockdowns. So how was training under those COVID lockdowns? And then the second part of the question, I actually forgot. So why don't you answer that while I figure out the second part of the question?
Yeah. So initially it was tough. We couldn't train. When we first went into national lockdown. So that meant, you know, any way that sort of included any type of public gathering apart from, you know, essential stores like your supermarkets, got shut down. So that included the gyms. So for about, I want to say like maybe a 6 to 8 week period, I was just cycling, running. At the time, I lived with my father, who was my head coach, so we could do a little bit of pad work and stuff. But, you know, as far as any real sparring and training, you know, it was very limited. We did well, apart from doing the pad work and, you know, a little wrestle in the garden. It was tough to get anything in, really. I think after about 8 or 10 weeks, then we got a green light in Wales for pro athletes to train. So there's an handful of us at the gym who obviously classify in that category. So we managed to start getting a little bit of training in about 3 times a week, you know, and then I had the call for Fight Island. And obviously, fortunately, my teammate Brett Johns had the call as well. So me and him pretty much trained together every day, along with, you know, a good 3 or 4 other guys who were helping push us. So although it probably wasn't as ideal as your normal fight prep, I suppose we managed to get it done and get it done well under the circumstances. Now we're out of national lockdown. Although it looks like we're going to be going back into national lockdown just as I go to Vegas, so we'll see how that one plays out. But at the minute, I'm getting a lot more training in, I would say, for this fight than Fight Island, because the gyms are now allowed to open. You know, I'm back to being able to get 3-4 sessions a day, and you know, I'm at the gym a lot more. The sessions are a lot longer. There's a lot more bodies on the mat. You know, there's a lot more coaches there. So prep for this one has felt a little bit more normal than the last one. But you know, again, it's like living on eggshells at the minute because we're just waiting and waiting and waiting. I mean, they're reviewing it sort of every week, and you hear like the Prime Minister's going to do an announcement today, and you don't know if he's going to say we're going into lockdown. I mean, there's guys up in England, so they've got like a tiered system. So it's like tier 3 means that the area is very high risk. And I know Liverpool. Then I know like Molly McCann and Darren Till, probably best known people from Liverpool. For you Americans, is in lockdown. The gyms are closed, the pubs are closed, the restaurants are closed, so they now can't train. And I think it's just, unfortunately, I don't like to say it, but I think it's a matter of time before that becomes nationwide, and we go back into full lockdown again, which is a shame for me because, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but when we're looking at the statistics over on this end, the statistics now are a lot lower than what they were at the beginning of the initial lockdown. So for them to be taking backward steps, it just seems a little bit unnecessary in my honest opinion. So just fingers crossed if they can hold it out for another 2-3 weeks so I can get out to Vegas, and keep the gym open till then. I'll be happy. If they want to lock it down after that, then I know it sounds selfish, but at least the fight is out the way,
Right. And it's funny how I've talked to a ton of people. I think this show actually started the first or second week of lockdowns in the United States. And I've talked, most of the fighters we talked to, I think this is the 25th episode or 26th episode, how some people, it's either one or the other. One, the fighters are either listening to lockdown orders and just not doing anything. I remember like Tom Evinger is just like, yeah, I haven't trained in weeks, blah, blah, blah. And then you got guys like Jared Vanderaa, who owns his own gym in California, and he boarded up the windows to stop the rioters, but B, he was putting up the windows to stop anybody from seeing in because he was still holding full training sessions during lockdown, which was even funnier because he said half of the police department from his city was his training partners. So it's funny that there's no middle ground.
Yeah, I was fortunate in the sense of obviously my gym is Shaw Mixed Martial Arts. It's my father's gym.
Right.
So because me and him lived together during the lockdown, I mean, towards the end of it, we were going down, and although we weren't open to the public as such, but me and him were managing to do a little bit more than what we did at the beginning. But they're very strict, it's like there's considering a lot of the gyms around here are considered, small or sort of medium-sized businesses. The fines and stuff they're putting out on these so-called, on these small businesses are just going to be crippling. So a lot of time the risk didn't sort of, the risk was a lot higher than what the reward would have been in getting a training session, if that makes sense. So it was a tough couple of weeks. I mean, we're all right now, but again, like I know I keep repeating myself, it's just fingers crossed we don't go back into that scenario, because it was very tough mentally and physically, I think, for not just myself, but a lot of the guys at the gym.
Yeah, and it's not sustainable. Not to get into the political aspect of lockdowns, but it's not sustainable. It has. I mean, what was it? There was a statistic in the United States that like 40 to 60% of small, business restaurants are not going to open ever again because of these lockdowns. I mean, at one point you do have to look at the economic aspect and not just the health aspect, unfortunately.
Yeah, you do.
So. I thought of the second part of the question, which was kind of answered, but I figure I'll ask it anyways. In times like this, with the amount of guys, dropping out of fights quickly and fights needing to be filled, does this kind of make it? I know, some fighters do train like this, a lot don't. They have time off, et cetera, to recover. Does this turn every kind of day of the gym like a 24/7, 365 training camp? You have to stay fight ready. You have to basically be in an unknown training camp just in case you do get that last minute call.
Yeah, I think especially for the guys, there's a lot of guys who train with me now, and they're not in the UFC, but they're on, they're maybe not on the verge, but their record is good enough now, and like, my coaches have said to them, now is as good a chance as ever, especially with the pullouts. If you're medically cleared, you can make weight, and they can get you to Fight Island or Vegas or whatever, then, you've got as good a chance now, probably a better chance of getting signed now on short notice than you would have had before. So, you see guys from the UK, from Europe, like Khamzat Chimaev, Cameron Else, a guy who I've trained with in the past at Jackson's. I think he stepped in on 8 or 9 days notice. So there's a couple of guys who train with me who are sort of technically, they're not in fight camp just yet. They're looking to fight on the Cage Warriors bill at the end of the year, but they're going a little bit more intense now than what they would have, this early on in the camp usually, because there's always that chance you could get a call. I mean, you'd be a fool not to stay ready, in my opinion. It's a little bit different for sort of myself and Jack, because we're in there, we sort of know our schedule, we know when we're fighting. But for guys who are on the cusp, guys like Mason Jones, even who's on that path to being signed, now is the chance. I spoke to Mason after his fight, and he said, he's straight back into camp, ready for that call. So now is as good a time as ever for young up and comers to be getting signed, and you'd be foolish not to stay ready, in my opinion.
Right, and of course not to be disrespectful to any fighter, because I respect anybody who steps in the cage. But I mean, there's been a handful of guys that the UFC signed on late notice, or filling in on a couple days notice. I respect them for that. I mean, if you look at them, they're probably not UFC ready, but it's an opportunity.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's the other end of the stick. There are guys who are getting in now that wouldn't get in if it wasn't for the fact they could take the short notice fight and make weight on short notice. But I suppose you've got to be in it to win it, and sometimes it pays to stay ready. I mean, will they ever go on to be UFC champion? Probably not. But if they get their 2-3 fights with a promotion, and for a lot of people that's a dream come true. So you can't sort of knock them then for taking the opportunity. If the opportunity comes and they're ready and someone else isn't, then that's on them, and that's on the person who's not ready. So,
right.
Like you said, they may not necessarily be at the level they should be at to be in there, but they took their chance.
Right, and if they get 2 or 3 fights, that's probably going to be 2 or 3 of their biggest, probably their 2 and 3 biggest paychecks they're going to get as a fighter. And then the other thing you got to think too is if they get cut and go back to the regional scene, that's also going to drive up their income
their value
in the regional scene.
Yeah. Well, you see it all the time, especially on like the domestic and the European shows. These fighters, they may go in the UFC and sort of lose their 2 fights and get cut, but they're then labeled as, he's fighting a UFC vet. So, like you said, it's a bigger pay than what they're used to. If they get cut, then it drives their value up a little bit more anyway, going back to the sort of UK or the domestic scene, obviously, if they're American guys. So it's a win-win, to be honest. If they're ready, they just as well jump in there and do it.
Right, and that UFC vet label works as well going back to the regional scene, because that goes back to the old school way of getting your own sponsors, as opposed to when you're in the UFC, you have that sponsor. You're not really allowed to put other stuff on your fight trunks unless you have a deal with Monster or whoever, which is really only a couple guys like Cerrone and Cormier. But yeah, guys like, name that comes off to my head, Craig White, who I believe just retired, but when he left the UFC, you would have to think it's probably easier for him to get sponsors because of his UFC veteran status.
Yeah, 100%. And I fought a guy, Vaughn Lee, who was a UFC veteran. I think it was my 8th pro fight, and Vaughn actually did very well in the UFC. I think he was 3-5 or 3-4, something like that. But wherever he fought, he drew this big attention and this big buzz because he was this UFC vet. And he had lost his last fight in the UFC before he fought me, but it was a fight that made sense to take because it sort of, it gave him a little bit of pulling power. And so, it's like you said, it's one of them, despite the fact they've been cut, it just pulls it, I suppose it pulls the extra eyes and the extra followers they've gained when being in the UFC. It helps with sponsors and stuff like that too.
Exactly. And then to finish this off before we talk about your upcoming fight, it also gives you a little bit more marketability when it comes to maybe getting a Bellator contract, especially for European fighters now that Bellator does spend a lot of time in Europe developing fighters and prospects. PFL, with their tournament format, they're always looking for guys with reputable resumes, guys with UFC backgrounds, etc. So, it'll help you try and secure jobs with those promotions as well, who also pay pretty well, in terms of the overall, piece of the pie. So going forward, you do, like we mentioned, you have a fight in a few weeks coming up here. You will be facing Khalid Taha, a fellow European, but you will be fighting in Las Vegas. So why don't you just comment on that fight, comment on Khalid as an opponent, and how you see yourself winning this fight? Yeah,
Khalid is a very dangerous opponent. No qualms in saying he's probably my toughest opponent yet. Very good record. I think 14-2, something like that. I believe he's won his last 2 fights and looked good in them. Very explosive guy, decent grappler, decent wrestler. But he obviously is, after watching his fights, is evident to see he shines in the, in the striking area where he can let them heavy hands go. But it's a fight I'm very confident in. I think style-wise, it's a fight that matches up well to mine. I'm very confident in my boxing. I've got a great boxing and Thai boxing coach, and I've done it in fights before, where I've spent a round or 2 on the back foot and still won the round just by using my range and using my my technical boxing skills, rather than being that guy who steps in the pocket and lays heavy lever throws. So wherever the fight goes, I'm very comfortable. If you was an outsider looking in, you would probably say I'm better off looking to get the fight to the ground. I mean, I'm evidently probably going to have a lot more success there and be, I imagine my skill level compared to his on the ground is a lot higher. I don't think he's fought a sort of wrestler and a grappler whose MMA style is like mine. But yeah, he's a very dangerous opponent. It's a fight I'm very confident in. A fight I see me getting the finish in, and I'm just happy to be in there with a top level guy who, if I can beat him and beat him in style, I think we won't be far off a sort of top 15 spot then, or a fight that's going to put me in a position to call for a top 15 fight,
Yeah, I think that's the correct analysis. I think you hit it on the head. Taha is definitely a guy that people look at as the striker here, and you as the grappler. I think people forget that you do have striking because your wrestling is so dominant. But yeah, Taha's a guy with knockout power. It's a good matchup. I like it. I like when the UFC puts two top prospects against each other and kind of see who's the one that comes out with their head above the water. So definitely a fight to watch. I believe this is on the Thiago Santos Glover Teixeira card, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's the one.
Perfect. So that's in about, as of this taping, it'll be in about 3 weeks. So hopefully our viewers go ahead and check that one out. It will be on ESPN Plus, if I'm not mistaken. Should be a great scrap. And speaking of scraps, the great segue, which is why I host this show, obviously. We have a fight. This was taped on Friday, so this will be tomorrow. The show will go up today at some point. So a fight that everybody was really looking forward to in the main event. It's Ortega and the Korean Zombie. But before we get to that, we discussed that we'll talk about the co-main event. It was supposed to be a heavyweight bout between Cyril Gane and Ante D'Elia. Unfortunately, D'Elia has a legal proceeding. PFL did pull their contract card on him. I was reading the article. D'Elia's team disagreed because he took one fight in 2 years, and they haven't even put on a show this year. So there's a contract dispute, so that will not happen. So instead, the co-main event will be a women's flyweight bout. You got Caitlin Chukagian taking on former strawweight champion Jessica Andrade. Now, Jack, Andrade is moving up from strawweight back to flyweight. She has fought in all three women's divisions out of featherweight in the UFC. So comment on this fight. How do you think this fight goes? And if you have a prediction, go ahead and throw it our way.
Yeah, I think this one's again. It's a striker versus grappler. I think, in my honest opinion. I know Andrade is moving up the weight, but she's very, very powerful. You've seen that in her strawweight fights. Against sort of Rose, we've seen her even in the fight she's lost. She's still landed them bombs and done damage. So there's no sort of surprise to what she's gonna do. Andrade's gonna come out, throw heavy hand and try and get that finish. I think Caitlin is very she's a good grappler. Does she train with the Dana Death Squad, I believe?
That one I'm not sure of. I know that she trains with Renzo Gracie's team.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I remember that when she fought. She fought for the title, didn't she? She fought
Valentina. Yep.
Valentina, yeah. So she's obviously to be training with those guys at Renzo. She's an elite level grappler. So I think you're gonna see that. She's gonna come out, look to put Andrade down, or maybe initiate a scramble where she can perhaps jump to a back take, or just get hold of her. I think she's not gonna want to be out trading. And I think anyone in the division is going to avoid sitting in the pocket and trading with Andrade. So it's a striker versus grappler match. How it's going to go, it's going to go one of two ways. She's either going to catch her early, Andrade, and get her out there. But I think the longer the fight goes on, we have seen Andrade in the past, tire a little bit. So if Caitlin can drag the fight into deeper waters, I think it's going to sort of get her a little bit tired, and it'll sort of open up them opportunities a little bit more for the takedown or for the scramble where she can look for that submission. But there's one I'm on the fence on a little bit, to be honest, because it really does depend who sort of, implements their game plan better. If she can avoid the big power, then I would sort of be swayed towards Caitlin. I think she's a little bit more well-rounded. But on the flip side, Andrade needs that one shot. And, that's very uncommon in the women's division. There's not many big power punchers. So if she lands that one shot, I think it sort of will sway the fight in another direction. So I'm 50-50 on that one.
Yeah, obviously a good breakdown. I agree with a lot with what you said. Andrade, you're right, power puncher with a guillotine choke. So Chukagian does need to be careful on those shots because Andrade will grab your neck, and she doesn't even need to have perfect technique. She just has she has the squeeze,
Brute squeeze, yeah.
So, I mean, that's what she's got to be careful about. Now, Chukagian is famous for being possibly the most annoying striker. She throws in volume, but she makes a Serena Williams tennis noise every time she throws a goddamn punch. So, you also have to consider the size difference. Like you said, Andrade, very powerful. I believe she's only 5'3", which is kind of shorter for the division, whereas Chukagian's kind of a bigger flyweight. She's probably 5'9", 5'10", longer limbs. She can strike from the outside. So Andrade is really going to have to work to get on the inside. And this is where I think the problem for Andrade is going to come in this fight is as she comes in, Chukagian's going to lean on that jab as she moves out. And then once Andrade tries to get close or is close enough, Chukagian can definitely look for that takedown, catching her coming in. And then also in the clinch, she's going to have the leverage as well, just being so much taller. And, Andrade probably beats her in terms of pure power, but in terms of leverage and length, Chukagian has a huge advantage, especially up against the cage. So I agree. I think this is an interesting fight. I will take Chukagian. Probably by decision, and like you said, Andrade may tire out as the fight goes on, and I think, like you said, you had a good breakdown there, and I agree with most of what you said there, so I will take Chukagian in this one. Now, moving on to the main event, the last fight, and then we'll get you out of here so you can go back to doing whatever it is you do. As mentioned, we have Brian Ortega, former featherweight title challenger, taking on another former featherweight title challenger in the Korean Zombie, Chan Sung Jung. Now, I mean, this is a fight that the minute it was announced, fans were stoked. I was stoked. This is a fight I'm definitely looking forward to. So Jack, why don't you give us a breakdown of what you see here, and if you got a prediction, go ahead and throw it our way.
I think this one is a tough one in terms of how to predict, because it all depends on how Ortega comes back from that loss to Holloway. I mean, he hasn't fought since the loss, and I think in a lot of people's minds, they sort of remember that loss, and I know it was a great fight, but sort of it was a dominant performance from Holloway, and despite being tough and having his moments, sort of Ortega didn't necessarily have a lot of didn't look as good as we've seen him look in the past in that fight. But then you scrap that fight and look at his run to challenging for the title. He looked like a world beater, like KOs. Submission game speaks for itself. He literally needs half a scramble or half an opportunity to sink in a guillotine or a back take. And then again, you look over to the Korean Zombie, and I mean, he's one of those guys who can do it all. We've seen him wrestle, grapple, but he likes to bang, doesn't he? Let's be honest, He likes to strike. He's known for those big knockouts. So it all depends on sort of which Ortega turns up, or if the Max loss has done him good. He's had a long time off. He's done the right thing, in my opinion. Took a bit of time off after a bad loss, let his body recover, let his head recover. So it all depends if he comes back, with a fire lit under him, or if he comes back and he's still, a little bit on edge from that loss. I do think the size can play a little bit of a factor in this one as well. I know the Zombie is not a small featherweight, but obviously Ortega is a big guy when he blows back up on fight day. And I think if he can get hold of the Korean Zombie and sort of try to wear on him a little bit. I mean, it's a 5-round fight. If he can sort of wear on him, use his size for early on, I think we may see Ortega sort of implement his game a little bit better later on. My head says it's 50-50, but for some reason my heart is saying Ortega's gonna sneak a submission in there. But not straight away. I see it, being a very close fight. But if he can use his size early on, I think he's going to initiate one of them, guillotines, or if he can get a back take, something like that. I see them having a mad sort of scramble because the Zombie can get scrappy as well. And I see him cinching in a sub sort of late on, maybe 3rd, 4th round. If I was a betting man, that's what I'd be looking at.
Well, if you're a betting man, you're going to Vegas soon, so you may want to keep that on the down low. Great breakdown of that fight. I totally agree. Now, with as you were alluding to, a long layoff for Ortega. He has not fought since December of 2018, so it'll be about 22 months since his last fight, which could be one of two things. He could be rusty, or it could have been a nice refresher just to get like you said, get his body right. But people forget that Chan Sung Jung did take, I believe, 3.5 years off because he was in the Korean military. And he came back, and since coming back from that is 3-1 with 3 knockouts. So, maybe the layoff isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I agree with you. Ortega's scrappy on the feet, but I think his best bet is the submission game. They call him T-City for a reason. He has an excellent triangle choke, and as you mentioned, he has a nasty guillotine choke. The Cub Swanson one, I'm surprised he didn't pull his goddamn head off his shoulders. But yeah, I agree. I think the longer the fights goes on, I think it does favor Ortega. And if he's able to, like you said, put some body weight on him and grapple with him a little bit as opposed to making this a straight up kickboxing match, I think that will favor him more and more as the fight goes on. So I also will take Ortega. But again, I agree with you. It's a very toss up fight.
Yeah, I think he fought a little bit of the wrong fight, I think, Ortega against Holloway. I know it's easier said than done, but like you said, he did very much. Yeah, he sort of bought into the kickboxing match, the trading blows. He had a little bit of success, and I think that's what forced him into that sort of back and forth on the feet. So I think this time he's able to be just a little bit more tactical, stick to the game plan, which I imagine is to, like we said, wear on him, and then obviously look for that sub later on.
For sure. Awesome. Well, thank you for those predictions and those breakdowns, Jack. Sometimes we have fighters on the show. They have no idea who the fighters are, even though they're main eventers. So I'm looking at you, Tanya Evinger. But anyways, thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. I will give you the floor right now. If you have any shout outs you need to give, anybody you want to thank, go ahead and do that right now. And then where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, just shout out obviously all my teammates, my coaches, my friends and family. I would shout out my sponsors, but I've got quite a few, and I know I'll forget one of them off the top of my head, and they'll be upset then. So check out my social media, Jack Show MMA on Instagram and Twitter, Jack Tank Show on Facebook. You can see all my sponsors on there. If you're local and you're in any sort of area that they have expertise in, feel free to give them a shout and tell them I sent you.
Perfect. So we would Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the whole deal.
Yeah, Twitter and Instagram, Jack Show MMA. I'm more active probably on Instagram and Twitter than Facebook, but I have got a Facebook page, it's Jack Tank Show. As I always say in these interviews, don't add my personal page because I never use it, and I probably won't accept you if I don't know you. So if you want to keep up to date on Facebook, follow the page that's dedicated just for the fighting.
Perfect. Now I'm going to plug myself and whore myself out for a minute here, and then we'll let you go. Keep checking out Combat Press, MMA Intel, and the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network. We have shows every week. I'm actually filming 2 more today, so it's going to be a long day of fighter interviews. That'll be for the next 2 weeks. Continue to check out my Twitter and Facebook. We have content posted there every day, scouting reports, podcast episodes, rankings, etc. All that on MMA Intel. And other than that, just keep watching this show. Like I said, we'll have shows for the intern. We have five weeks of shows lined up after today. So, Jack, thank you again very much for coming on the show and accommodating my time zone. I really appreciate it. A lot of good insight. I know that the people that watch this show will definitely check you out 3 weeks from now on ESPN Plus on UFC Fight Night, Santos versus Teixeira. So for Jack Shore, I am Riley Kontek saying continue to watch the fights, continue watching the show, go fuck yourselves. Have a good night.